Harlem, New York, 12 Augustus 1965, 6:43 p.m. The heat in Harlem that evening was oppressive, the kind of humidity that stuck to your skin and made the air feel heavy, like a physical weight pressing down on the concrete. But the heat wasn't the reason the streets of 125th Street were vibrating with tension. It was the sound of a siren fading in the distance and the blood still drying on the pavement outside the corner bodega. 20 minutes earlier, two officers from the notoriously corrupt 28th Precinct had crossed a line that even in 1965, even in a city divided by race and power, was considered sacred. They hadn't just arrested a teenager for loitering, they had made an example of him. They had beaten 16-year-old Marcus Wallace until he was unconscious, throwing him into the back of a patrol car like a sack of garbage while his mother screamed from the sidewalk. The officers laughed. That was their mistake. They laughed because they believed they were untouchable. They believed the badge on their chest was a shield that protected them from the consequences of their cruelty. They were wrong. News traveled through Harlem faster than electricity. Within minutes, the shock turned to rage. People poured out of brownstones and businesses. Young men grabbed bottles. Older men clenched their fists. The atmosphere was chaotic, a powder keg waiting for a single spark to turn into a full-blown riot. Screams for revenge echoed off the brick walls. It was the sound of a community pushed too far, ready to burn everything down in a desperate attempt to be heard. But high above the chaos, in an apartment on Edgecombe Avenue, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat quietly at his dining table. He wasn't screaming, he wasn't running, he was finishing his coffee. Bumpy Johnson, the godfather of Harlem, understood something the angry mob outside did not. Rage without discipline is suicide. But rage with strategy? That is a weapon. He listened to the reports coming in from his runners. He heard about the beating. He heard about the officers involved, O'Malley and Henderson, two men known for collecting protection money and breaking bones when the payments were light. Most importantly, he heard about the crowd gathering on Lenox Avenue, a mob without a leader, preparing to throw themselves against the fortified walls of the police station only to be slaughtered. Bumpy stood up. He adjusted his suit jacket, ensuring the lines were sharp. He checked his cufflinks. His face was a mask of stone, devoid of the anger that was consuming the streets below. To the outside world, he was a criminal, a gangster. But tonight, the legal system had failed. The police had become the criminals. And when the system fails, men like Bumpy Johnson step in to rewrite the rules. "Get the car," Bumpy said to his bodyguard, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "And tell the lieutenants to meet me at the corner. We aren't going to start a riot, we're going to end one." The bodyguard hesitated. "Bumpy, there's hundreds of them out there. They're looking for blood. If we go down there, we get caught in the crossfire." Bumpy looked at him, his eyes cold and calculating. "We don't get caught in crossfire, we direct it. Tonight, we teach the 28th Precinct the difference between a mob and an army." As Bumpy stepped out onto the street, the air shifted. The chaotic shouting didn't stop immediately, but a ripple went through the crowd. They saw him, the man who had walked through Alcatraz and returned stronger, the man who played chess with judges and street thugs alike. Bumpy didn't shout. He didn't wave a weapon. He simply walked into the center of the mayhem, his presence demanding a silence that even the sirens couldn't drown out. He raised one hand. Slowly, the screaming subsided. The bottles were lowered. 500 pairs of eyes turned to him, waiting. They were angry, yes, but they were also looking for direction. They were looking for a way to make their pain matter. "You run at that station now," Bumpy said, his voice carrying over the humidity, calm but cutting like a razor, "and you give them exactly what they want. An excuse to shoot you. An excuse to write you off as animals." He paused, looking into the eyes of the young men in the front row. "We don't give them excuses. We give them consequences. We march to that station. But we don't march as a mob. We march as citizens. We don't throw rocks. We throw our presence. We surround them. We trap them in their own fortress. And we don't leave until we get what is ours." The shift was palpable. The energy transformed from frantic heat to cold, hard steel. Bumpy turned toward the direction of the police station. 500 people fell in line behind him. No longer a riot. Now, They were a siege engine. The 28th Precinct, West 123rd Street, 7:12 p.m. The 28th Precinct wasn't just a building. In 1965 Harlem, it was a fortress. It was a concrete symbol of a system that didn't serve the people living in its shadow. It occupied them. Inside, the officers were already bracing for the impact. They had received the calls. A mob was coming. They had broken out the riot gear, helmets, shields, and batons. They were loading tear gas canisters, joking nervously about cracking skulls to blow off steam. They expected chaos. They expected screaming, flying bricks, and the disorganized fury of a wounded community. They were ready for a fight, but they weren't ready for Bumpy Johnson. At 7:15 p.m., the sound of the march reached the station, but it wasn't the roar of a riot. It was the rhythmic, terrifying thud of 500 pairs of shoes hitting the pavement in unison. It sounded less like a protest and more like a closing prison door. Captain Sullivan, a man who had built his career on intimidation and graft, stood by the second-floor window looking down. He held a lit cigar, his face set in a sneer, waiting for the first rock to shatter the glass so he could give the order to charge. But as the crowd turned the corner, the cigar froze halfway to his mouth. They didn't rush the stairs. They didn't throw Molotov cocktails. They didn't scream slurs at the cops lining the entrance. Instead, at a silent hand signal from Bumpy Johnson, the 500 men and women split. It was a maneuver of military precision. One group peeled left, the other peeled right. They flowed around the precinct like dark water, encircling the entire city block. Within 3 minutes, the police station was completely cut off. Every exit, every driveway, every side door was blocked by a wall of silent, unmoving bodies. Bumpy Johnson stood alone in the center of the street, directly facing the main entrance, where a dozen armed officers stood nervously clutching their nightsticks. He stood in the dead zone, the empty space between the police line and the citizens. It was a position of supreme arrogance and supreme confidence. He lit a cigarette, the flame illuminating a face that showed zero fear. Inside the station, the atmosphere shifted instantly from aggression to confusion. The police radio crackled. "Dispatch, we can't get patrol cars out of the garage. The driveway is blocked." "Over." Another voice cut in. "Captain, the back alley is sealed. We're trapped in here." Sullivan looked down at Bumpy. For the first time in his career, he felt the cold grip of claustrophobia. This wasn't a public disturbance. This was a siege. The man down there hadn't brought a mob to break windows. He had brought an army to revoke their authority. Bumpy took a drag of his cigarette and looked up. He didn't need a megaphone. The silence he had commanded from 500 angry people was louder than any shout. He was sending a message that every cop in that building understood in their gut. You are not the hunters anymore. You are the prey. The officers at the front door shifted their weight. They looked at the sea of faces staring back at them, faces of men they had harassed, women they had ignored, elders they had disrespected. But tonight, those faces weren't looking away. They were staring with the cold judgment of an executioner. Bumpy checked his watch. 7:25 p.m. The psychological pressure was just beginning. He turned to his lieutenant, a large man named Junebug, and spoke softly. "Tighten the circle. No one goes in. No one comes out. Not a uniform, not a delivery truck, not a stray dog. If they want to leave this building tonight, they're going to have to ask me for permission." The circle tightened. The space between the police and the people shrank by another 2 feet. The air grew thinner. The siege of the 28th Precinct had officially begun, and the man holding the keys wasn't the captain inside. It was the gangster standing on the street, outside the 28th Precinct. 7:48 p.m. Inside the station, the air conditioning was running, but Captain Sullivan was sweating. The phone lines were jammed with calls from terrified officers' wives and confused city officials, but no help was coming. Every patrol car dispatched from neighboring precincts had hit mysterious traffic jams, delivery trucks broken down at key intersections, blocking the arteries into Harlem. Sullivan realized with a sinking feeling that this wasn't just a crowd outside, it was a military blockade. He had 2 choices: hide like a coward or go out there and try to bluff his way back into power. He chose the bluff. The heavy steel doors of the precinct swung open. Sullivan stepped out, flanked by 4 of his biggest officers, hands resting on their holsters. He walked to the edge of the stairs, trying to project the authority he usually wielded like a club. "This is an unlawful assembly," Sullivan bellowed, his voice cracking slightly. "I am ordering you to disperse immediately. If you do not clear this street in 5 minutes, we will use force. We will arrest every single one of you." His words hung in the humid air. In any other neighborhood, on any other night, that threat would have sent people running. But tonight, the threat hit the wall of silence and died. Nobody moved. Nobody flinched. 500 people simply stared at him, their expressions unreadable. Bumpy Johnson detached himself from the shadow of a street lamp. He flicked his finished cigarette onto the pavement and crushed it with the heel of his shoe, slowly, deliberately. He walked toward the stairs, stopping exactly 10 feet from the captain. He didn't look up at Sullivan. He looked through him. "Captain," Bumpy said, his voice level and conversational, as if discussing the weather, "you seem to be confused about the situation. You think you're holding a megaphone, but really, you're holding a shovel. And you just keep digging." Sullivan's face turned red. "Johnson, I should have known. I can arrest you right now for inciting a riot." "What riot?" Bumpy gestured calmly to the silent crowd. "I don't see any violence. I don't see any looting. I see concerned citizens standing on a public street." "Can you point to a single broken window, Captain? Can you point to a single law being broken other than the ones your men broke when they nearly beat a 16-year-old boy to death an hour ago?" Sullivan stiffened. "That's police business. Now clear the street." Bumpy took one step closer. The officers behind Sullivan tensed, hands gripping their revolvers. Bumpy ignored them. "We aren't clearing anything," Bumpy said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming colder. "We aren't leaving until O'Malley and Henderson, the 2 animals who put Marcus Wallace in the hospital, are brought out here, not to be mobbed. We don't want to touch them. We want to see them stripped of their badges. We want to see them in handcuffs. We want to see them put in a transfer car to downtown booking for assault." Sullivan laughed, a nervous, barking sound. "You want me to arrest my own men because you say so? You're delusional, Johnson. I have 50 men in here. I have backup coming. I'll sweep you off this street like trash." Bumpy smiled. It was the smile of a shark sensing blood in the water. "Your backup isn't coming, Captain. 2 sanitation trucks just happened to break down on 125th and Lenox. A moving van is stuck sideways on Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard. You're an island right now. And as for your 50 men inside," Bumpy looked up at the windows of the station, where frightened faces of young officers were peering out. "They know that if they fire a single shot, if they release a single canister of tear gas, this disciplined crowd becomes a tidal wave. They know they don't have enough bullets for 500 people. They know that if this goes violent, they might take some of us with them, but none of them are walking out of that building." Bumpy locked eyes with Sullivan again. "I'm the only thing keeping that wave from crashing down on you, Captain. I'm the dam. Do you really want to threaten the dam?" For a long, agonizing minute, there was silence. Sullivan looked at the blocked streets. He looked at the silent army encircling his station. He looked at Bumpy Johnson, who stood with his hands in his pockets, relaxed, waiting. The captain realized the terrifying truth. The gangster wasn't threatening violence. He was offering mercy, and the price of that mercy was 2 corrupt cops. Inside the 28th Precinct, 8:03 p.m., when the heavy steel doors slammed shut behind Captain Sullivan, the sound echoed through the station like a coffin lid closing. The air inside was stale, smelling of sweat, old coffee, and rising panic. 50 officers turned to look at their commander. They were gripping their batons so hard their knuckles were white. They wanted orders. They wanted to hear that the National Guard was coming, that the cavalry was on the hill. Instead, Sullivan walked past them without a word, his face pale and slick with perspiration. He walked straight to his office, leaving the door open. He picked up the phone to call the commissioner. The line was dead. Bumpy Johnson hadn't just blocked the roads. His influence reached deep into the city's infrastructure. Somewhere, a switch had been flipped, or a line had been accidentally cut by a union worker who owed Bumpy a favor. Sullivan slammed the receiver down. He looked out into the squad room. In the corner, Officers O'Malley and Henderson were sitting on a desk, smoking nervously. They were still acting tough, loud-mouthing about teaching those animals a lesson, but their eyes were darting around the room. They felt the shift. 10 minutes ago, they were the heroes of the precinct, the tough guys who kept the streets in line. Now they were looking less like fellow officers and more like liabilities. Sullivan walked out of his office. He stopped in the center of the room. "They want you too," Sullivan said, his voice flat. O'Malley laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "Let them want. Since when do we take orders from a pimp in a suit? Give the order, Cap. Let's go out there and bust some heads." Sullivan didn't blink. "Look out the window, O'Malley." O'Malley hesitated, then walked to the blinds. He peered through the crack. What he saw made the color drain from his face. It wasn't just the number of people. It was the stillness. 500 people standing in the dark, illuminated by the street lamps, completely silent. They weren't moving. They weren't blinking. And standing front and center, staring directly at the window, was Bumpy Johnson. "That's not a protest," Sullivan said softly. "That's a siege, and we are alone. No backup, no phone lines. And the mayor isn't going to send the army to save 2 cops who beat a kid into a coma for sport." The room went deadly quiet. The blue wall of silence, the unwritten rule that cops protect cops, no matter what was facing the one thing stronger than loyalty: self-preservation. The other 48 officers in the room began to subtly shift away from O'Malley and Henderson. It was a primal instinct. The herd was distancing itself from the sick animals to save the group. Outside the precinct, 8:15 p.m. The humidity was breaking, replaced by a cool breeze that carried the scent of rain. Bumpy Johnson hadn't moved an inch. His legs must have been tired, but he stood like a statue carved from granite. Junebug leaned in, whispering, "Bumpy, the crowd is getting restless. The young bloods, they want to throw something. They're saying talking time is over." Bumpy's eyes didn't leave the front door. "Hold them. If one rock flies, we lose the moral high ground. Right now, we are the law, and they are the criminals. If we attack, we become just another riot. Tell the boys on the perimeter, if anyone bends down to pick up a brick, break their hand." It was a brutal order, but a necessary one. Bumpy knew that the police were praying for violence. Violence would justify them opening fire. Violence would turn the narrative from police brutality to gang riot. Bumpy was denying them that luxury. He was suffocating them with peace. He checked his watch again. The pressure inside that building had to be unbearable. He knew men like Sullivan. They were bullies, not warriors. A warrior fights to the death for a principle. A bully fights only when he knows he can win. And Sullivan knew he had already lost. "They're breaking," Bumpy murmured to himself. "The rat is looking for a way out of the trap." Inside the precinct, 8:20 p.m. O'Malley pulled his service revolver, his hand shaking. "I'm not going out there. They'll tear us apart. You're selling us out, Sullivan." The other officers drew their weapons, not aiming at the door, but leveling them at O'Malley. "Put it down, O'Malley," a sergeant said, his voice grim. "We got families. We ain't dying in here for your mistake." Sullivan stepped forward. "It's simple math, boys. You two go out, face the charges, and maybe you do some time. Or we all stay in here. The crowd burns this place down, and we all die. Bumpy Johnson isn't leaving, and neither are we." O'Malley looked at the faces of the men he had worked with for 10 years. He saw no sympathy. He saw only the cold calculation of survival. The brotherhood was dead. Sullivan pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The metal clicked ominously in the silent room. "Turn around," Sullivan ordered. "It's time to pay the bill." Outside the 28th precinct, 8:32 p.m. The heavy steel doors of the precinct opened for the second time that night. But this time, Captain Sullivan didn't walk out with his chest puffed out or his hand on his holster. He walked out slowly, his eyes fixed on the ground, looking like a man marching to a funeral. Behind him came 4 officers. They weren't flanking him for protection. They were dragging 2 men. A gasp rippled through the crowd of 500 people. It wasn't a cheer. It was the sound of disbelief. Officers O'Malley and Henderson, The terrors of 125th Street, the men who had broken bones and laughed about it for years, were stumbling down the precinct stairs. Their hands were cuffed behind their backs, their hats were gone. But the most shocking detail, the detail that Bumpy Johnson had specifically demanded, was their chests. Where their badges used to shine under the streetlights, there was only dark blue wool. They had been stripped. Bumpy Johnson watched them descend. He didn't smile. He didn't cross his arms in satisfaction. He simply watched, his face as impassive as a judge passing a death sentence. He was validating the transaction. When the group reached the bottom of the stairs, O'Malley looked up. His face was a mask of rage and humiliation. He locked eyes with Bumpy. He wanted to spit, to scream, to curse the man who had turned his own brotherhood against him. But when he met Bumpy's gaze, the words died in his throat. He saw something in Bumpy's eyes that terrified him more than the mob: indifference. To Bumpy, O'Malley wasn't a rival. He was just a mess that needed to be cleaned up. Captain Sullivan stopped 5 feet from Bumpy. The power dynamic had completely inverted. The police captain was now presenting an offering to the crime boss to buy his station's survival. "They are under arrest," Sullivan said, his voice raspy. "Assault. Abuse of authority. They are being transferred to central booking downtown immediately." Bumpy took a slow drag of a fresh cigarette. He stepped forward, invading Sullivan's personal space, forcing the captain to hold his ground or retreat. Bumpy looked at O'Malley's wrists. He checked the tightness of the cuffs. "I don't see them in a patrol car, Captain," Bumpy said quietly. "I don't want them riding in the front seat joking with their buddies. I want them in the cage, like the criminals they are." Sullivan gritted his teeth. "The transport van is pulling around now." At that moment, a low rumble started in the crowd. A bottle clinked against the pavement. A young man in the front row stepped forward, screaming, "Kill them! Let us have them!" The tension snapped back instantly. The 500 people, seeing their tormentors vulnerable, surged forward. The collective rage that Bumpy had held in check was about to burst. The 4 officers guarding the prisoners flinched, reaching for their weapons. This was the moment it could all go wrong. This was the moment the massacre could start. Bumpy didn't turn around. He simply raised his right hand, palm open, high in the air. "Stop." The command wasn't spoken, but it hit the crowd like a physical wall. The surge halted. The screaming died down to a murmur. Bumpy turned his back on the police and faced his people. "I told you," Bumpy's voice cut through the night, sharp and commanding. "We are not animals. We do not beat men in handcuffs. That is what they do. That is why we are here, to show them the difference." He looked at the young man who had screamed, "You want blood, or do you want victory? Blood washes away in the rain. Victory lasts forever. Look at them. Look at your masters. They are in chains. You did that. Your discipline did that. Don't throw it away for a moment of satisfaction." The young man lowered his head. The crowd stepped back. The discipline held. The back of the precinct opened, and a black transport van rolled out. The officers shoved O'Malley and Henderson into the back. The sound of the metal doors slamming shut clang was the sweetest sound Harlem had heard in years. It was the sound of accountability. As the van engine roared to life, Bumpy turned back to Sullivan. "You made the right choice, Captain. Tonight, you get to go home to your family. Try to remember how this feels. Try to remember that your badge is given by the people. And what we give..." Bumpy leaned in close, his voice a whisper that only Sullivan could hear. "We can take away." Bumpy gestured to Junebug. "Open the street. Let them pass." The sea of people parted. The transport van drove slowly through the crowd. No rocks were thrown. No windows were smashed. Just 500 pairs of eyes witnessing the impossible. The police retreating from Harlem, defeated not by bullets, but by the will of one man. Lenox Avenue, 8:50 p.m. The taillights of the police transport van faded into the darkness of Harlem, taking with them the 2 men who had terrorized the neighborhood for years. The street was left in a heavy, stunned silence. The siege was over. Captain Sullivan stood at the top of the precinct stairs for a moment longer, looking down at the man who had defeated him. He wanted to say something, a threat, a warning, anything to reclaim a shred of his dignity, but he found he had nothing left. His fortress had been breached without a single brick being thrown. He turned around, walked back into his station, and locked the steel doors from the inside. The click of the lock was audible. It was the sound of the police admitting they were afraid of the streets. Bumpy Johnson didn't wait for applause. He didn't make a victory speech. He simply adjusted his cuffs, checked his tie, and turned to the crowd. "Go home," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a final order. "Show's over. Don't give them a reason to come back tonight. We won the battle. Don't lose the peace." The crowd of 500 didn't disperse chaotically. They moved with a strange, newfound dignity. They had arrived as a mob, but they were leaving as a community that had tasted power. They looked at Bumpy with a mixture of awe and fear. He wasn't just a gangster anymore. Tonight, he was the only government that mattered in Harlem. Junebug opened the car door for Bumpy. As the black Lincoln Continental pulled away from the curb, the streets seemed to exhale. Inside the car, the air was cool and quiet. Junebug was vibrating with adrenaline. He kept checking the rearview mirror, grinning. "Did you see Sullivan's face, Bumpy?" Junebug laughed, shaking his head. "He looked like he swallowed a rat. We broke them. We actually broke them. They're going to talk about this for 50 years. Bumpy stared out the window at the passing storefronts of 125th Street. He lit another cigarette, the lighter flaring in the darkness. "We didn't break them, Junebug," Bumpy said, his voice devoid of celebration. "We just reminded them of the rules. The police are like a gang, the biggest gang in the city. And like any gang, they only respect one thing: leverage." "But we got O'Malley and Henderson," Junebug insisted. "That's justice, right?" Bumpy exhaled a plume of smoke. "Justice is a fairy tale they tell in Sunday school. This wasn't justice. This was business. Those cops were bad for business. They were causing chaos. Chaos brings heat. Heat stops the money. I didn't remove them because they were evil. I removed them because they were unprofessional." He turned to look at Junebug, his eyes hard. "Never confuse what we do with what the preachers do. The preachers march for equality. I march for order. Tonight, we proved that Harlem has order. That makes us dangerous. And that keeps the police on their side of the line." The car turned onto Street Nicholas Avenue. The streets were quiet now. The riot that could have burned Harlem to the ground had been extinguished by the cold logic of one man. "What happens tomorrow?" Junebug asked, his excitement fading into seriousness. "Sullivan isn't going to forget this. The commissioner isn't going to forget this. Tomorrow," Bumpy said, crushing his cigarette into the ashtray, "they will try to rewrite what happened. They'll say they arrested the officers to maintain public safety. They'll try to pretend I wasn't there. Let them. Let them keep their pride. As long as they keep their distance." The car slowed as it approached Bumpy's apartment building. He looked at the doorman, who nodded with a newfound level of reverence. "But mark my words," Bumpy added softly, "they will come for me. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. You don't humiliate an empire without the empire trying to strike back. We need to be ready. Tonight was chess. Tomorrow, the real war starts." Bumpy stepped out of the car. He didn't look back. He walked into his building alone, carrying the weight of a victory that felt heavy, like a loaded gun. Police Headquarters, Lower Manhattan. The 13th of August, 1965, 9 a.m. The morning sun hit the polished mahogany desk of Police Commissioner Howard, but it brought no warmth to the room. On the desk lay the morning edition of the New York Times. The headline didn't say "Riot in Harlem." It said, "Order restored in Harlem. Citizens patrol ends standoff." That is Noord come, Don Hem to Desavant. There was no mention of Bumpy Johnson's name in the headline, but every man in the room, the mayor, the commissioner, and the chief of detectives knew exactly who Citizens Patrol was. Commissioner Howard slammed his hand on the desk. "We look like fools. Sullivan arrested his own men on the orders of a gangster. If we let this stand, every precinct in this city loses its authority. The law is not a negotiation." The chief of detectives, a man named Miller with eyes like flint, shook his head. "We can't arrest Johnson for last night, Commissioner. He didn't break a single law. He stood on a sidewalk. If we arrest him now, we turn a criminal into a civil rights martyr. The city will burn." Howard leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Then we don't arrest him. We suffocate him. If he wants to act like a legitimate community leader, treat him like one. Hit every business he owns with health code violations. Check every fire exit. Audit every tax record. Park a patrol car in front of every club he runs and check ID for every person walking in. Bleed him dry. Make him toxic so no one in Harlem dares to do business with him." It was a declaration of bureaucratic war. They couldn't win with batons, so they would win with paperwork and harassment. Harlem, 11:30 a.m. The retaliation began instantly. At the Blue Velvet Lounge, one of Bumpy's most profitable clubs, the music stopped. The lights came on. A team of fire marshals, accompanied by 4 uniformed officers, was tearing the place apart. They were measuring the width of the doorways, checking the expiration dates on the fire extinguishers. "This exit is 2 inches too narrow," the marshal announced loudly, ensuring the patrons heard. "Shut it down. Indefinite closure until renovations are inspected." Down the street, at a diner Bumpy used for meetings, a health inspector was pouring bleach on fresh food, claiming it was stored at the wrong temperature. Outside, police cruisers were double parked, writing tickets for every car that stopped for more than 10 seconds. The message was clear. The Empire strikes back. Bumpy sat in the back of his barber shop on 135th Street, watching the chaos unfold through the window. He was getting calls every 5 minutes. His lieutenants were panicking. The money flow was being choked off. The police were trying to bankrupt him to force a surrender. Junebug paced the floor, furious. "They're closing everything, Bumpy. The betting parlors, the clubs, even the laundromats. They're harassing the customers. We're losing thousands an hour. We need to hit back. Let's send some boys to throw bricks at the precinct." Bumpy lowered his newspaper. He looked at Junebug with disappointment. "You still think like a soldier, Junebug. They want you to throw bricks. That gives them the excuse to bring in the National Guard. They are using the book against us. Health codes, fire codes. It's smart." Bumpy stood up and walked to the phone. He didn't dial a lawyer. He dialed the number of the Italian. "Genevieve's family?" Junebug asked, confused. "No," Bumpy said, his voice cold. "The bagman." He looked at his reflection in the mirror, adjusting his collar. "The police are a business, Junebug. And right now, the 28th Precinct runs on my payroll. Every week, envelopes go to the sergeants, the lieutenants, even the captains to look the other way for the numbers game. That's their mortgage payments. That's their mistress's rent." Bumpy turned to Junebug, his eyes gleaming with a ruthless idea. "Send the word out. Total freeze. No more envelopes. Not a single dollar goes to a cop in Harlem starting today. If they want to enforce the law so strictly, let's see how they survive on a cop's salary." Junebug's eyes widened. "Bumpy, that's dangerous. If you cut off their graft, they'll get desperate." "Good," Bumpy smiled, a shark-like grin. "Desperate men make mistakes. They are trying to suffocate me. I'm going to starve them. Operation Freeze is in effect. Let's see who blinks first when the hungry dogs turn on their masters." By noon, the order had spread through the Harlem underworld. The Blue Wall was about to hit an economic depression. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just fighting the law, he was demonetizing it. The backroom of Satin Doll nightclub. The 20th of August, 1965. 10:45 p.m. It had been 7 days since Bumpy Johnson initiated Operation Freeze. 7 days since a single dollar of protection money had flowed from the Harlem underworld into the pockets of the NYPD. In the ecosystem of corruption, 7 days is an eternity. Sergeant Miller, a bagman for the precinct who had collected envelopes for 15 years, stood at the bar. He looked tired. His uniform was pressed, but his eyes were anxious. He wasn't there to make an arrest. He was there to collect the weekly payment from the numbers racket, a payment he relied on to pay his mortgage in Queens. Red, one of Bumpy's most trusted lieutenants, sat at a corner table counting stacks of cash. He didn't look up when Miller approached. "You're late, Red," Miller said, trying to keep his voice authoritative, though it wavered slightly. "The captain is getting impatient. It's Friday." Red slowly placed a rubber band around a thick stack of bills. He looked up, his expression blank. The bank is closed, Sergeant. Miller blinked, confused. What do you mean, closed? I see the money right there. That's Bumpy's money, Red said calmly. Your money? That doesn't exist anymore. Mr. Johnson said, until the fire marshals stop inspecting our doors every hour and until the patrol cars move from in front of our clubs, the rent is zero. Miller's face flushed red. He leaned in, whispering harshly, You can't do this. We have an arrangement. If I go back empty-handed, Sullivan is going to unleash hell. We'll raid this place tonight. Red stood up. He was a head taller than Miller. The music in the club seemed to drop in volume. Go ahead, Red said, his voice loud enough for the patrons to hear. Raid us. Arrest us. But remember this, Miller. When you arrest us, you arrest your paycheck. You think the city pays you enough to cover that boat you just bought? You think your pension covers your daughter's private school? You need us more than we need you? Miller stood frozen. The brutal truth of the situation hit him like a physical blow. The police had the guns, but the gangsters had the lifeline. He turned around and walked out, his pockets empty and his hands shaking. 28th Precinct Locker Room. The 21st of August, 1965. 7 a.m. The atmosphere inside the station was toxic. The camaraderie was gone, replaced by the sharp, metallic smell of fear. Captain Sullivan sat in his office, staring at a stack of resignation letters. 3 officers had quit in 2 days. They couldn't survive without the graft. The blue wall wasn't crumbling because of morality. It was crumbling because of economics. Outside, in the squad room, a fight broke out. 2 officers were shoving each other. You told us to squeeze him, one officer screamed at a lieutenant. We squeezed him, and now my car is being repossessed. You said he would fold. He isn't folding. We are starving. Sullivan watched through the blinds. He realized he had made a fatal strategic error. He had treated Bumpy Johnson like a street thug who could be bullied. But Bumpy was a CEO, and Bumpy had just executed a hostile takeover of the precinct's morale. The phone on Sullivan's desk rang. It was the commissioner again. But Sullivan didn't answer. He knew what was coming. The city hall didn't care about the corruption, they cared about the order. And right now, the police were losing control of the narrative. Bumpy's penthouse. 8:30 p.m. Bumpy sat on his balcony, looking over the lights of Harlem. He was playing a game of chess against himself. Junebug poured a drink. They're panicking, Bumpy, Miller almost cried at the club last night. The word on the street is that Sullivan is losing the locker room. They're ready to mutiny. Bumpy moved a white pawn forward. Pain is a great teacher, Junebug. For years, they thought the money was a right. Now they realize it was a privilege. A privilege I granted, and a privilege I revoked. So, do we turn the money back on? Junebug asked. If we push them too far, they might do something crazy. A desperate dog bites. Not yet, Bumpy said, his eyes narrowing. We don't want them just hungry. We want them on their knees. Sullivan is still in charge. As long as he has a badge, he's a threat. We need one more move. The checkmate. Bumpy picked up the black queen and knocked over the white king. Tomorrow, we don't just starve them. We offer them a meal. But they have to eat it from my hand. 22 West Restaurant, Harlem. 22 Augustus 1965, 1 p.m. The lunch rush was over. The restaurant was empty, except for one table in the back corner. Bumpy Johnson sat there, a white napkin tucked into his collar, slowly cutting into a steak. He looked like a king holding court. At 1:05 p.m., the door opened. Captain Sullivan walked in. He was wearing civilian clothes, a gray suit that looked a little too loose, as if the stress of the last 10 days had physically shrunk him. He didn't look like the arrogant commander who had stood on the precinct steps. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. Sullivan walked to the table. Bumpy didn't look up. He continued to chew, savoring the silence. Sit, Bumpy said, pointing to the chair opposite him with his knife. Sullivan sat. He looked at the steak, then at Bumpy. We need to end this, Johnson, Sullivan said, his voice low. 3 more officers resigned this morning. The commissioner is talking about an internal affairs audit. If that happens, they'll find the books. They'll find the ghost payroll. We all go to prison, you included. Bumpy wiped his mouth with the napkin. He took a sip of water. I don't go to prison, Captain. I go to court. And in court, I have lawyers. You? You have a pension that is about to evaporate. Sullivan clenched his fists on the table. What do you want? You made your point. You starved us out. You humiliated us. Are you happy? Happiness is for children, Bumpy said cold. I want stability. You see, Captain, you broke the contract. The contract was simple. We pay the tax, and you let us run the business. You keep the violence off the streets, and we keep the order. But you got greedy. You got violent. You let your dogs off the leash. Bumpy reached under the table. He pulled out a thick brown envelope. He placed it on the white tablecloth. It sat there like a brick of gold. Sullivan's eyes locked onto the envelope. He knew what was inside. It was the back pay, the 10 days of graft money that had been frozen. It was the mortgage payments, the tuition fees, the lifeline of the 28th Precinct. Sullivan reached for it. Thud. Bumpy's steak knife slammed into the table, inches from Sullivan's hand. Sullivan froze. That doesn't come for free, Bumpy said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. Not anymore. The price has gone up. We can't pay more, Sullivan stammered. The rates are already— I don't want more money, Bumpy interrupted. I want control. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into Sullivan's soul. From today on, no officer patrols 125th Street without my approval. If you send a rookie down here who thinks he's a cowboy, I send him back in a hospital bed, and you write it up as an accident. If there is a problem in my territory, a robbery, a fight, your men don't touch it until my men have handled it. You are not the police here, Captain. You are the cleanup crew. Sullivan stared at him. The terms were absolute surrender. Bumpy wasn't just bribing the police. He was effectively deputizing himself. He was demanding veto power over the NYPD in Harlem. If I agree to this, Sullivan whispered, I'm not running a precinct anymore. I'm working for you. Bumpy pulled the knife out of the table. He slid the envelope across the tablecloth until it touched Sullivan's hand. You've been working for me for 10 years, Captain. Bumpy smiled, a cold, predatory smile. You just forgot to read the fine print. Sullivan looked at the envelope. He looked at Bumpy. He thought about the audit. He thought about his pension. Slowly, shamefully, Captain Sullivan picked up the envelope. He slid it into his jacket pocket. Done, Sullivan said. Good, Bumpy said, returning to his steak. Now get out of here. You're ruining my appetite. Sullivan stood up and walked out of the restaurant. He had his money. He had saved his precinct. But as he stepped out into the Harlem sun, he realized he had left something behind that he would never get back. His badge was still on his chest, but his authority now belonged to the man eating steak in the back room. Harlem streets. 2 p.m. Word spread faster than the wind. The patrol cars were back, but they were driving differently. They drove slowly. They didn't stop anyone. When they passed a group of Bumpy's men on the corner, the officers didn't glare. They nodded. It was a subtle shift, invisible to the average citizen, but clear as day to the streets. The hierarchy had been restored. But this time, everyone knew who sat at the top. Bumpy walked out of the restaurant. Junebug was waiting. It's done? Junebug asked. It's done, Bumpy said. Tell the boys to open the clubs. Tell the numbers runners to get back to work. Harlem is open for business. Did he fight it? He fought like a man who was drowning, Bumpy said. He grabbed the only rope he could find, even if it was tied around his neck. They walked down the avenue, the king of Harlem and his shadow. The war was over, but Bumpy knew the truth about power. You never truly win. You just survive to fight the next challenger. It was 1968, 3 years after the siege. The 28th Precinct still stood on West 123rd Street. The bricks looked the same, the steel doors looked the same, but everyone knew that the DNA of the building had changed forever. Inside a patrol car parked across the street, a rookie officer sat in the passenger seat. He was fresh from the academy, holding a baton that had never struck a man. He pointed out the window at an older black man walking slowly down the sidewalk. The man was dressed in an impeccable gray suit, moving with a calm rhythm, flanked by 2 silent bodyguards. That's him, right? The rookie asked, his hand reaching for the door handle. "That's Johnson. I heard there's a warrant. We should bring him in." The veteran sergeant behind the wheel didn't just stop him. He grabbed the rookie's wrist with a grip of iron. "Don't," the sergeant hissed. "You don't touch him. You don't look at him too long. And you definitely don't try to bring him in." "Why?" the rookie asked, confused. "He's just a gangster." The sergeant looked at the old man walking with the dignity of a head of state. He remembered the night the station was surrounded. He remembered the terrifying silence of 500 people. He remembered the feeling of being a rat trapped in a cage. "He's not a gangster, kid," the sergeant whispered, watching the figure pass by. "He's the landlord, and we are just living in his building." The patrol car drove past Bumpy Johnson slowly. Bumpy didn't turn his head. He didn't acknowledge them. He didn't have to. The story of that night in 1965 never made it into the history books. The newspapers called it a civil disturbance. The police reports called it a negotiation. But on the streets, it became a legend. It became a blueprint for a kind of power that transcended crime. Bumpy Johnson had taught Harlem a lesson more valuable than any numbers racket. He taught them that violence is not about how hard you hit. It is about where you apply the pressure. He could have burned the station down, but that would have brought the army. Instead, he used the one weapon the system wasn't designed to fight: order. He used the police's own greed against them. He turned their corruption into his leverage and their authority into his shield. Bumpy stood on the corner of 125th Street one last time. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the empire he had built and defended. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He was a killer. But in a world where the law was broken, he was the necessary evil that kept the chaos at bay. He took a final drag of his cigarette and flicked it into the gutter. He watched the smoke rise and fade into the evening air. "They think power is noise," Bumpy murmured to himself. "They think power is sirens and gunshots. They never learned." He turned and walked into the darkness, a man who had forced the world to respect him, not by shouting, but by whispering. Real power is when you don't have to say a word.